Ain't she sweet? See her coming down the street. I ask you confidentially, ain't she sweet?
Don't do it! For God's sakes, don't do it!
1 hour later, a 50-year-old man walked into the police station on Central Avenue downtown and said,
I want to give myself up. I've shot my wife.
But the murder trial of George Remus would not be an open and shut case. What Remus admitted to the police was, in his opinion, not guilt of the premeditated murder of his wife Imogene, but was in fact his moral and ethical obligation.
If you have a clear conscience, you have nothing to fear, and consequently, why should I run away? It was the unwritten law.
And Remus felt he knew the law. Earlier in his professional life, he had been a highly regarded defense attorney in Chicago. He delighted in boasting he had successfully defended 18 out of 18 murder defendants. That was before he changed occupations in 1920 to become mega wealthy as a bootlegger. During a 5-year period of the early 1920s, he reportedly deposited $5 million, calculated to be the equivalent of $58 million in 2008. He and Imogene owned a mansion on Hermosa Avenue and 8th Street in Tony Lower Price Hill, which included a one-of-a-kind $100,000 indoor swimming pool. He felt he had the experience and money, and he was ultra confident he could convince a jury on his own behalf.
Remus had a narcissistic personality, very self-absorbed.
As it turned out, following a 5.5-week trial featuring a circus atmosphere nearly 70 years before O.J., one juror said it took just 10 minutes to deliberate.
I ask you confidentially, ain't she sweet?
After 2 years of bitter divorce haggling, the 7-year marriage of George Remus and his wife Imogene was to end October the 6th, 1927, in a downtown Cincinnati courtroom. According to testimony of Remus chauffeur George Klug, he picked Remus up at his Lower Price Hill mansion on Hermosa Avenue at 7 a.m. Remus was riding in the front passenger seat. Rather than drive directly to the courthouse, he told Klug to drive to the Hotel Alms, where Imogene and her daughter Ruth were staying. Remus said the reason for this unlikely trip, which was 2 miles out of the way, was he wanted to talk to his wife before court began. He could have waited outside the courthouse, which was much closer to his Price Hill mansion, but instead, they drove to the Alms, where Remus chauffeur Klug testified they waited 10 to 15 minutes outside in their car before Imogene and Ruth emerged to hail a cab. Ruth testified she and her mother caught the cab at the Alms at 8 a.m. for their 9 a.m. court appointment. But it was not a conversation that took place. Rather, it was a deadly car chase. Ruth testified that Remus's chauffeur cut off the cab in Eden Park, forcing the cabbie to slam on his brakes and bring the cab to a halt. Remus got out of his car, charged back to the cab, met Imogene around the cab door as she was trying to get out. He pulled her out of the cab with a gun in his right hand. Imogene saw the gun and pleaded with him not to shoot.
Don't do it! For God's sakes, don't do it!
But Remus put the gun in her midsection and shot her. 1 bullet in the stomach. Ruth says by then she was hysterical, and she grabbed Remus, begging for mercy for her mother. But Remus barked at her.
She can't get away with this.
Ruth asked the cabbie for help, but the cab driver froze. Imogene pleads.
For God's sakes, won't somebody help me?
Finally, a car passing by stopped and drove Imogene and her grief-stricken daughter to Bethesda Hospital downtown. Remus's chauffeur and Imogene's taxi driver both fled the scene. Remus threw the gun away and walked to Gilbert Street. Within the hour, he hitched a ride and walked into the police station downtown on Central.
I want to give myself up. I've shot my wife.
At 10:45 a.m., Remus is informed while in his jail cell that Imogene, age 38, has died from the gunshot. According to the New York Times, a Cincinnati police lieutenant told Remus, "You've accomplished what you've set out to do." Remus asks,
Is she dead?
"Yes, what have you to say?" asks the lieutenant.
She who dances down the primrose path must die on the primrose path. I'm happy. This is the first peace of mind I've had in 2 years.
And this is where it gets very interesting, I think. He suspected that he could defend himself and that he could get away with it.
I had a moral right to act as I did, and I can convince a jury of it.
Hamilton County Chief Prosecutor Charles Taft feels it's his team that will convince a jury, but it will be of first-degree premeditated murder. He, after all, is going to try a convicted felon who has done time in the penitentiary for bootlegging and who admits he shot his wife in front of eyewitnesses. But George Remus, the hardball lawyer who says he's 18 for 18 in Chicago murder trials, is going to put his perfect record on the line. He is going to represent himself, and he's going to put Imogene and her alleged lover, Franklin L. Dodge, on trial. Remus is going to portray himself as the sympathetic figure, the benign suffering victim of an overzealous prosecutor and the victim of a wicked affair trying to strip him of his worldly possessions and that which he held most dear, the wife he loved.
There was never a case like mine. No husband was ever so betrayed.
Remus is going to put everyone on trial except himself. He isn't worried about the evidence. He seeks the sympathy of the jury and the court of public opinion. He pleads not guilty by reason of insanity.
He spoke with a passion because he believed what he was saying. When he honestly believed that she deserved to die because she cheated on him.
December 20th, 1927. The trial is in its 6th week. Both sides rest, and an avalanche of testimony goes to the jury. And according to one juror, it takes the Remus 12 10 minutes to decide.
We, the jury, on the issue joined, find the defendant not guilty of murder on the sole ground of insanity.
After a slight pause, the courtroom erupted in cheers. Remus, in tears at the verdict, gushed to the jury and crowd.
Thank you. I just wanted American justice, and I thank you for it.
After his verdict, there was a celebration in the streets of Cincinnati, and this person being freed. Think about that. A murderer just killed his wife, yet people showed up to applaud the verdict.
Post-verdict remarks by jurors reflected the jubilant attitude of public opinion. The jury felt sorry for Remus. It thought the prosecution was too harsh and thought his dead wife Imogene was not a murder victim, but a gold digger living a fast-lane life who got what was coming to her. The jury's only regret? The judge had ordered Remus could only be found not guilty on grounds of insanity. Juror Robert Hosford was quoted in several newspapers.
If we could have acquitted him clean, we surely would have done so. We decided that the man had been persecuted long enough.
But out-of-town newspaper reporters were not impressed by the decision handed down here in the conservative heartland. One reporter inquired, "Is that the way they always do things down here?"
People made fun of Cincinnati. Only in Cincinnati can this take place. That's all. Well, but the Cincinnati that we know, and the Cincinnati that we know back then, it's just inconsistent with Cincinnati. Cincinnati is known to be more conservative, more righteous, more concerned about these sorts of values.
Ultimately, Remus was committed to the Lima State Hospital for the criminal insane. He served 6 months. Then the Ohio Supreme Court upheld his petition that he was not insane and ordered his release. George Remus had avoided the murder charge because he convinced the jury he was insane. And then he avoided the penalty of the mental hospital because he convinced the court that he was not insane. Remus returned to Cincinnati and faded into time. During the final 25 years of his life, he married his third wife, his ex-secretary, and lived quietly in a humble home in Covington, Kentucky. But his life closes shrouded in some mystery. It is uncertain how he made a living post-Imogene. There's an assumption he was in real estate because he tore down the Price Hill mansion on Hermosa and sold off the land in smaller sections. And it's uncertain how old he was when he died. It is certain that in August 1950, Remus suffered a severe heart attack and eventually slipped into a coma. He lingered in his own kind of prison for about a year, dying in January 1952. Various reports listing his age of death anywhere between 75 and 79 years old. One obituary read that he lived as a king and died at age 78, while the headline proclaimed him fabulous.
One of the editorials praised him for being a kind of a Cincinnatus figure. So here is an editorial in our local newspaper in 1952 paying tribute to this person. And yet he had killed his wife.
Prior to his trial, Remus had declared sanctimoniously,
I'm a man of principle. I've never smoked, drank, or swore in my life.
but at his death, he had illegally sold alcohol, was a convicted felon, and he had gunned down a wife. George Remus, king of the bootleggers, had amassed money, celebrity, the streets had filled to celebrate him, and a nation had followed his murder trial. Yet, on the day of his funeral, only 30 people attended.